This is What Came Up, the etymology podcast for everyday things. I'm your host, Deej Penhollow. We're going to get right into it. Let's get started. Hello everybody. Now that the Halloween hustle and bustle is done and over with, it's time to slow down and be thankful for the past year, no matter what happened and where it's taken you. Every chapter of your life sets you up for the future. It's important to remember that where you've been gets you to where you're going. So we're going to dive into Thanksgiving, and I hope that all of you enjoyed my Halloween specials and learned a lot. We're also going to learn a lot about Thanksgiving, and then on Thanksgiving Day, we will start a plethora of Christmas episodes. I will dive into all the sorts of weird stuff that we do on Christmas and why we do it. But for now, we're going to dive into Thanksgiving and learn about what that is and where it came from and any myths or legends or anything like that, and talk about what's true and what's not true, and talk about why we ended up eating and doing what we do. Thank you for joining me. Let's go ahead and get started. In 1621, the Plymouth colonists and the Wampanoag shared an autumn harvest feast that is acknowledged today as one of the very first Thanksgiving celebrations among the colonies. For more than 2 centuries, days of Thanksgiving were celebrated by individual colonies and states, and it wasn't until 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, that President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a national Thanksgiving Day to be held each November. September of 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers, an assortment of religious separatists seeking a new home where they could freely practice their faith, and other individuals lured by the promise of prosperity and land ownership in the New World. After a treacherous and uncomfortable crossing that lasted 66 days, they dropped anchor near the tip of Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination at the mouth of the Hudson River. 1 month later, the Mayflower crossed Massachusetts Bay, where the Pilgrims, as they are now commonly known, began the work of establishing a village at Plymouth. Throughout the first brutal winter, most of the colonists remained on board the ship, where they suffered from exposure, scurvy, and outbreaks of contagious disease. Only half of the Mayflower's original passengers and the crew lived to see their first New England spring. In March, the remaining settlers moved ashore, where they received an astonishing visit from a member of the Abenaki tribe, who greeted them in English. Several days later, he returned with another Native American, Squanto, a member of the Pawtucket tribe, who had been kidnapped by an English sea captain and sold into slavery before escaping to London and returning to his homeland on an exploratory expedition. Squanto taught the Pilgrims, weakened by malnutrition and illness, how to cultivate corn, extract sap and maple from trees, catch fish in the rivers, and avoid poisonous plants. He also helped the settlers forge an alliance with the Wampanoag, a local tribe, which would endure more than 50 years and tragically remains one of the sole examples of harmony between European colonists and Native Americans. In November of 1621, after the Pilgrims' first corn harvest proved successful, Governor William Bradford organized a celebratory feast and invited a group of the fledgling colony's Native American allies, including the Wampanoag chief Massasoit. I'm so sorry. I have no idea how to say that. Now remembered as America's first Thanksgiving. Although the Pilgrims themselves may not have used the term at the time, the festival lasted 3 days. While no record exists of the first Thanksgiving's exact menu, much of what we know about what happened at the first Thanksgiving comes from the Pilgrim chronicler Edward Winslow, who wrote the following. Quote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that we might that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help," it's kind of hard to read, "as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king, Massaoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and the others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are far from want, that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." Wow, that was hard to read. End quote. Okay. Historians have suggested that many of the dishes were likely prepared using traditional Native American spices and cooking methods, because the Pilgrims had no oven and the Mayflower sugar supply had dwindled by the fall of 1621. The meal did not feature pies, cakes, and other desserts, which had become a hallmark of contemporary celebrations. Pilgrims held their second Thanksgiving celebration in 1623 to mark the end of a long drought that had threatened the year's harvest and prompted Governor Bradford to call for a religious fast. Days of fasting and Thanksgiving on an annual or occasional basis became common practice in other New England settlements as well. During the American Revolution, the Continental Congress then designated 1 or more days of Thanksgiving a year. In 1789, more than 100 years later, George Washington issued the first Thanksgiving proclamation by the national government of the United States. In it, he called upon Americans to express their gratitude for the happy conclusion to the country's War of Independence and the successful ratification of the U.S. Constitution. His successors, John Adams and James Madison, also designated days of thanks during their presidencies. In 1827, the noted magazine editor and prolific writer Sarah Josepha Hale, author, among other countless things, of the nursery rhyme Mary Had a Little Lamb. Okay, so Sarah Josepha Hale, the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, launched a campaign to establish Thanksgiving as a national holiday. For 36 years, she published numerous editorials and sent out scores of letters to governors, senators, presidents, and other politicians, earning the nickname Mother of Thanksgiving. Abraham Lincoln finally heeded her request in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, in a proclamation message entreating all Americans to ask God to commend his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation. He scheduled Thanksgiving for the final Thursday in November, and it was celebrated on that day every year until 1939, when Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the holiday up 1 week in an attempt to spur retail sales during the Great Depression. Roosevelt's plan, known derisively as Franksgiving, F-R-A-N-K-S giving, was met with passionate opposition, and in 1941 the president reluctantly signed a bill making Thanksgiving the 4th Thursday in November. In many American households, the Thanksgiving celebration has lost much of its original religious significance. Instead, it now centers on cooking and sharing a bountiful meal with family and friends. Turkey, a Thanksgiving staple so ubiquitous it has become all synonymous with the holiday. It may or may not have been an offer when the Pilgrims hosted the inaugural feast in 1621. Today, however, nearly 90% of Americans eat turkey, whether roasted, baked, or deep fried, or smoked even, on Thanksgiving. According to the National Turkey Federation, other traditional foods include stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and, of course, pumpkin pie. Volunteering is a common thing on Thanksgiving Day, and communities often hold food drives and host free dinners for the less fortunate. Parades have also become an integral part of the holiday in cities and towns across the United States. Presented by Macy's department store in 1924, New York City's Thanksgiving Day Parade is the largest and most famous, attracting some 2 to 3 million spectators alongside of its 2.5-mile route, and drawing an enormous television audience. It typically features a marching bands, performers, elaborate floats conveying various celebrities, and a giant balloons shaped like cartoon characters. And at the end, guess who shows up? Santa Claus. This signifies the beginning of the Christmas season, unless you are me, who started celebrating Christmas on November 1st at midnight. Because I'm a freak show, I guess. I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, beginning in the mid-20th century and perhaps even earlier, the President of the United States has pardoned 1 or 2 Thanksgiving turkeys each year, sparing the birds from slaughter and sending them to a farm for retirement. A number of U.S. governors also perform the annual turkey pardoning ritual. That's interesting. I did not know that. For some scholars, the jury is still out on whether or not the feast at Plymouth really constituted the first Thanksgiving in the United States. Indeed, historians have recorded other ceremonies of thanks among European settlers in North America that predate the Pilgrim celebration. And in 1565, for instance, the Spanish explorer Pedro Menendez de Avil invited members of the local Timucua tribe to a dinner in St. Augustine, Florida, after holding a mass to thank God for his crew's safe arrival. And on December 4th of 1619, when the 38 British settlers reached a site known as Berkeley 100 on the banks of Virginia James River, they read a proclamation designating the date as a day of thanksgiving to the Almighty God. So, some Native Americans and many others take issue with how the Thanksgiving story is presented to the American public, and especially to the school children. In their view, the traditional narrative paints a deceptively sunny portrait of relations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, masking the long and bloody history of conflict between Native Americans and European settlers that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands. Since 1970, protesters have gathered on the day designated as Thanksgiving at the top of Coles Hill, which overlooks Plymouth Rock, to commemorate a national day of mourning. Similar events are held in other parts of the country. So this last part of the article here says, although the American concept of Thanksgiving developed in colonies of New England, its roots can be traced back to the other side of the Atlantic. Both separatists who came over the Mayflower and the Puritans who arrived soon after brought with them a tradition of providential holidays, days of fasting during difficult or pivotal moments, and days of feasting and celebration to thank God in times of plenty. As an annual celebration of harvest and its bounty, moreover, Thanksgiving falls under a category of festivals that spans cultures, continents, and millennia. In ancient times, the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans feasted and paid tribute to their gods after the fall harvest. Thanksgiving also bears a resemblance to the ancient Jewish harvest festival of Sukkot. Finally, historians have noted that Native Americans had a rich tradition of commemorating the fall harvest with feasting and merrymaking long before Europeans set foot on America's shores. So, there you have it. The badly read history of Thanksgiving. Sorry, some parts of those articles they're kind of hard to read sometimes, but that is the first episode, and I'm going to try to find some more information about different things that we do and how things became Thanksgiving staples and things like that. So maybe we'll do an episode of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade and notable things that have happened in or around that time, or those times in the past, and go from there. One of my favorite things that I just started doing was to look up old Thanksgiving Day parades and watch those on Thanksgiving morning, because the new ones are so woke and wild and weird, and and so new. And I am a product of the 90s, but my soul resides in the 80s. And I think that's because I was born right at the end of 1990, but the things that I grew up watching, a lot of it was 80s based. So my heart resides in the 1980s. So I like to watch the 1980s Thanksgiving Day parades, which has been pretty fun to do. That being said, I wish you all the very best, and I will see you next episode. Thank you.